The most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the deep underlying reasons why we're depressed and anxious in the first place. So I think what we've got to be asking is, what are the solutions? Now, that needs to be a really big, broad menu of stuff. For some people, absolutely chemical antidepressants should be one of the things on the menu. For some people, they're not right. For some people, they are. But we've got to have loads more things on the menu, precisely because this problem goes deeper than our biology. The solutions need to go deeper than our biology too.
This episode is supported by Huel.
Johann, welcome to the show.
I'm well chuffed to be here. Thanks for having me.
Are you?
Yeah. I don't know why I just said that in sort of like a Cockney.
I'm well chuffed,
I'm
Governor.
well chuffed to be here, Governor. I don't know why that came out in my voice. It's not my natural voice.
You're so excited it's turned you into a Cockney.
Exactly. I've become Dick Van Dyke.
Yeah. Why are you so happy to be here?
Life is good. I'm well chuffed. No, but I've listened to lots of episodes of the show, so it's really exciting to be here. I'm glad that my warm-up act was the next Prime Minister, so great. What more can you want?
From Sir Keir Starmer to Johann Hari. Two great leaders. Look, we're excited as well, actually, because if high performance stands for one thing, right, it's to try and change people's opinion of what high performance is. High performance isn't achieving great things. It isn't the fast car and the big house, right? High performance is actually doing the best you can where you are in the moment you're in. And for some people, that moment can be really difficult. Therefore, high performance might not look like high performance, right? But actually it is. So in the context of the things that you talk about and write about so well, depression and loneliness and obesity and self-loathing, self-care, all the
fun subjects.
All the fun subjects. What does high performance look like in the context of life being a challenge for people?
You know, I think the reason I was trying to figure out the answer to that question is because, for me, the book I wrote about depression and anxiety was called Lost Connections. And there were these two kind of mysteries that led me to try to answer that question. So the first mystery was, when I wrote the book, I was about to turn 40. And every single year that I'd been alive, depression and anxiety had increased in Britain, in the US, in fact, across the Western world. And I was like, that seems a bit weird. Why is it that with each year that passes, more and more of us are finding it harder to get through the day, right? What's going on? And I wanted to understand that because of a more personal mystery, which is that when I was a teenager, I remember going to my doctor and saying that I had this feeling like pain was kind of leaking out of me, right? I couldn't understand it. I was a bit ashamed of it. And my doctor told me a story that I now realise was well-intentioned but quite oversimplified. My doctor said, well, we know why people get like this. Some people just have a problem in their brain. There's a chemical missing. You're clearly one of them. All you need to do is take these drugs, you'll be fine. So I started taking an antidepressant called Seroxat. I felt much better. And then this feeling of pain came back, so she gave me a higher dose. Again, I felt better. Again, the pain came back, so I kept being given higher and higher doses until for 13 years I was taking the maximum possible dose you're allowed to take. And I still felt like shit, basically, a lot of the time. So I was sort of asking, well, I'm doing everything that I'm being told to do by the story our culture tells about depression and anxiety. Why do I still feel like this? So I ended up for the book going on this really big journey for 3 years all over the world, investigating depression and anxiety. And I learned that there's actually scientific evidence for 9 factors that can increase depression and anxiety, and loads of them have been rising in the culture. So actually, I think the core of the answer to your question is, there are many great things about the culture we live in. I'm glad to be alive today. But there's lots of factors in our culture which are undermining our ability to be the best version of ourselves, right? To achieve our higher goals. And of those 9 causes, so 2 of them are in our biology. That's why what my doctor said wasn't totally wrong, right? There are real biological factors that can contribute to depression and anxiety. There are changes that happen in your brain as you become depressed and anxious that can make it harder to get out. Your genes can make you more sensitive to these problems, though they never write your destiny. But most of the factors that cause depression and anxiety are not actually in our biology. They're factors in the way we live, right? And once you understand them, that opens up a very different way of thinking about these kind of problems. But I guess the core that connects a lot of those factors, not all of them, but a lot of them, is the way I would put it is, you know, everyone watching knows they have natural physical needs, right? You need food, you need water, you need shelter, you need clean air. If I took those things away from you, you'd be in real trouble real fast, right? But there's equally strong evidence that all human beings have natural psychological needs. You need to feel you belong. You need to feel your life has meaning and purpose. You need to feel that people see you and value you. You need to feel you've got a future that makes sense, right? And our culture has been getting less good at meeting those deep underlying psychological needs. I think we're all pretty much the same age for all of our lifetimes, right? For all sorts of ways that have been demonstrated scientifically. And the core of how we get back, how we get to being the highest performance version of you that you can be, which of course we're not all going to be, Lewis Hamilton or Keir Starmer or whatever, but the way we get to the highest iteration of who we want to be is partly by creating a culture and changing our own lives so that we can get our deeper psychological needs met, so that we're not sort of spinning out in this mode of disorientation and these signals that are telling us, oh, something's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong.
So for people who maybe still doubt that this is a real problem, these are some of the latest numbers and you'll know them. 1 in 6 adults in the UK affected by depression. 33% of 18 to 25-year-olds in the US are experiencing mental health concerns. A record number of children in Britain are suffering a mental health crisis. So we know all these numbers, right? What I don't understand is why we haven't taken greater steps towards these 9 factors that are causing this. I mean, maybe we could run through what those are and then try and work out why we're not doing more as individuals or as society to try and solve this.
I think part of the problem is we've told an oversimplified story that has eclipsed all the other stuff, right? So there was a moment I had a real breakthrough in understanding this. I was absorbing the science for a long time. I was trained in the social sciences at Cambridge University. I thought, right, I know how to read this stuff. I was interviewing all these leading experts all over the world, from Miami to Melbourne to Moscow, not just to cities that begin with the letter M. I don't know why I just did that. And there was a moment when so much of it fell into place for me. I went to interview a South African psychiatrist called Dr. Derek Summerfield, great guy. And he told me he happened to be in Cambodia in Southeast Asia in 2001 when they first introduced chemical antidepressants for people in Cambodia. They'd never had them in that country before. And the local doctors said to him, oh, what are antidepressants? They'd never heard of them. And so he explained. And they said to him, oh, we don't need them. We've already got antidepressants. And he was like, what do you mean? He thought they were going to talk about some kind of like herbal remedy, like, I don't know, ginkgo biloba or something. Instead, they told him a story. There was a farmer in their community who worked in the rice fields, and one day he stood on a landmine left over from the war with the Americans, and he got his leg blown off. So they gave him an artificial limb, they're good at that, and after a while he went back to work in the rice fields. But apparently it's super painful to work underwater when you've got an artificial limb, and I'm guessing it's pretty traumatic to go and work in the field where you got blown up. Yeah. The guy started to cry a lot, he refused to get out of bed, he developed what we would call classic depression, right? This is when the Cambodian doctors said to Dr. Summerfield, well, that's when we gave him an antidepressant. And he said, what was it? They explained that they went and sat with him. They listened to him. They realized that his pain made sense, right? You only had to speak to this guy for a few minutes to realize why he was so distressed. One of the doctors thought, well, if we bought this guy a cow, he could become a dairy farmer. He wouldn't be in this position that was screwing him up so much. So they bought him a cow. Within a couple of weeks, his crying stopped. Within a month, his depression was gone. It never came back. They said to Dr. Summerfield, so you see, doctor, that cow, that was an antidepressant. That's what you mean, right? Now, if you've been raised to think the way we have, that sounds like a weird joke. I went to my doctor for an antidepressant, she gave me a cow. But what those Cambodian doctors knew intuitively from this individual unscientific anecdote is what the leading medical body in the whole world, the World Health Organization, has been trying to tell us for years. If you're depressed, if you're anxious, you're not weak, you're not crazy, you're not in the main a machine with broken parts. You're a human being with unmet needs.
Did you know that less than half of Brits eat breakfast every day of the week? I mean, that's amazing. But why? Well, it's because we're all time poor, especially in the mornings. So we compromise. My fix is Huel's nutritionally complete high-protein shake, a complete meal in a bottle that slots perfectly into my life. Head to the link in the description for a free t-shirt on your first order with Huel. How can you resist that?
And I think the way we had to reframe depression and anxiety that really changed so many things for me is the story I was told, right? It's just a problem in your brain. Now, stress again, there are real biological contributions and drugs give some people some relief, and I'm sure we can come back to that. But that story, what it says to you is your pain is just a malfunction, right? It's like a glitch in a computer program. It doesn't mean anything. It's just, some technical problem. But the truth is depression and anxiety are not technical malfunctions in the main. They are signals. They're telling us something. They're telling us that something's gone wrong in our lives that we need to change, right? And so I think part of the problem, there's many reasons why we haven't engaged with these deeper reasons, these deeper factors that are causing depression. But partly, right at the moment of the depression and anxiety, we're told it doesn't mean anything. It's not a signal of anything. It's just a technical glitch that's just got to be fixed with drugs. So I think right at the start, we're sort of cut off, or the story disempowers us from understanding these deeper causes. And then there's lots of other reasons as well. But for me, that's the first one.
Yeah, that makes total sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm interested then if you'd explain what are the other factors then, if there's anyone watching this that maybe is struggling or they're getting the first signals that something isn't right. What have you learned from interviewing these many experts that we can do better?
Well, let's look at an obvious example that will be playing out for a huge number of people who are watching and listening, right? We are the loneliest society in human history in the Western world, right? We're only just behind the Americans. There's a study in the US that asks people, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing this study years ago, the most common answer was 5. Yeah. Now, the most common answer, not the average, but the most common answer is none, right? There are more people with nobody to turn to than any other option. There was a study in the US just before COVID, if I remember the figure right, I think 41% of Americans agreed with the statement, no one knows me well, right? Staggering. What's life like when no one knows you well? When you're just sort of spinning out on your own? And I spent a lot of time discussing this with one of the leading experts in the world on loneliness, an amazing man at Chicago University called Professor John Cassiopo, who sadly died recently. Amazing guy. And he made a huge number of breakthroughs in the study of loneliness and depression. He was the first person who proved that loneliness causes depression. I know that sounds like a bit of a no-shit Sherlock breakthrough, but actually, at the time before him, people thought, well, maybe it's just you become depressed and that makes you lonely, not the other way around, right? And I remember him saying to me one day, why do we exist? Why are we here? You, me, everyone you've ever met. One of the key reasons is that our ancestors on the savannas of Africa were really good at one thing. They weren't bigger than the animals they took down a lot of the time. They weren't faster than the animals they took down a lot of the time, but they were much better at banding together into groups and cooperating, right? That's our superpower as a species. Just like bees evolved to live in a hive, humans evolved to live in a tribe, right? If you ever get a bee and you separate it from its hive, it just goes crazy, right? It doesn't function on its own. And loneliness evolved as a signal saying, get back to the tribe, you're in terrible danger. In the circumstances where we evolved, if you were cut off from the tribe, you were screwed, right? If you got injured, you would die, you were very vulnerable. So loneliness was an essential signal. And that's still who we are, right? So you can begin to see, you understand that, right? I doubt there's many people watching or listening, oh, it doesn't sound right to me, right? This is kind of obvious once you know it. Loneliness is there's been a huge rise in loneliness. Loneliness causes depression, so this is one of the 9 reasons why depression has gone up, right? So once you understand that, it opens up a very different route to finding a solution. So I'll give you an example of one of the solutions that flows in this. There's lots of kind of different ways of thinking about it. One of the heroes of my book, Lost Connections, is an amazing man named Dr. Sam Everington. You should have him on. He's not based far from me. He's a doctor in East London, a GP, where I lived for a long time in Tower Hamlets. So sadly, he was never my doctor. And Sam had loads of patients coming to him with terrible depression and anxiety. And like me, he's not opposed to chemical antidepressants. In fact, he prescribes them. But he could see 2 things. Firstly, he could see that the people who were coming to him were often depressed and anxious for really understandable reasons like loneliness. And secondly, that antidepressants were helping some of them, but were usually just taking the edge off. They usually weren't solving the problem. So one day, Sam began to pioneer a different approach, one that's now spreading all over Europe. The fancy name for it is social prescribing, but it's pretty simple. So a woman came to see him called Lisa Cunningham, who I got to know later. And Lisa had been shut away in her home with crippling depression and anxiety for 7 years. And Sam said to Lisa, don't worry, I'll carry on giving you these drugs, but I'm also going to prescribe something else. I'm going to prescribe for you to come here to the doctor's offices couple of times a week to meet with a group of other depressed and anxious people, not to talk about how shit you feel. You can do that if you want to, but that's not the point. I want you guys to find something to do together that you find meaningful. So the first time Lisa went, she was so anxious, she started vomiting because it was just so overwhelming to be out of her house. But yeah, people rubbed her back. They talked to her. The group started talking. They were like, what can we do? These were inner city, East London people like me. They knew nothing about gardening. But there was an area behind the doctor's offices that was, it was known as Dog Shit Alley, which gives you a sense of what it's like.
Yeah.
The barren scrubland where dogs would go and shit. And they said, you know what? We could turn Dog Shit Alley into a garden. So they went to the library and took out loads of books about gardening. They started to watch clips on the internet of gardening. They started to get their fingers in the soil. They started to learn the rhythms of the seasons. There's a lot of evidence that exposure to nature is a really powerful antidepressant. But they started to do something even more important. They started to form a group. They started to care about each other. If one of them didn't show up, the others would go looking for them, be like, hey, what's wrong? How can we solve your problem, right? The way Lisa put it to me, as the garden began to bloom, we began to bloom, right? And there's been a series of admittedly small studies on this across the world. One small study in Norway found it was more than twice as effective as chemical antidepressants in reducing anxiety. I think for an obvious reason, and this is something I saw all over the world, from Sydney to Sao Paulo, the most effective strategies for dealing with depression and anxiety are the ones that deal with the deep underlying reasons why we're depressed and anxious in the first place. Now, it's not your fault you've been cut off from having your underlying needs met, right? Think about that Cambodian farmer. They didn't say to him, well, mate, it's your job to solve this, sort it out, right? They came together as a group and they solved it together. So I think what we've got to be asking is, what's the cow for the things that are screwing us up? What are the solutions? Now, that needs to be a really big, broad menu of stuff. For some people, absolutely, chemical antidepressants should be one of the things on the menu. For some people, they're not right. For some people, they are. But we've got to have loads more things on the menu, precisely because this problem goes deeper than our biology. The solutions need to go deeper than our biology too.
I think this is really powerful because, I've been in therapy in the past and suffered with anxiety and mental health problems. And certainly when it happened to me and I was in my early 20s, everything on the outside seemed okay, right? I just got a job on children's BBC. I just moved to London. I just left home. But only talking like this, I think, well, hold on, I'd left the home I'd been brought up in. I was a country boy from Norwich. I'd started working on kids' telly where actually it's very much everyone for themselves. You have a fleeting relationship with people, but the truth is you're in competition because you all want to get the next big job on the television.
I hear Gordon the Gopher's a right fucker.
Oh, he is evil. So understandably, I was probably one of the issues was probably an element of loneliness, right? But at no point did I think that the depression is anything other than the depression. Does that make sense? So it's almost like we have to change when we go, oh, you're depressed, go to the doctor. It's like, right, you're depressed, maybe you should go to the doctor, but maybe there's an underlying reason for this depression. Let's talk about what that is. And I think that we're in a place where we think that the depression is the thing, rather than the depression being the symptom of the thing.
100, so brilliantly put. I think you're absolutely right that what we do is we take something that's a signal and we act like it's a sort of thing in itself, right? We act like, people say, I've got anxiety, not I'm feeling anxious, which is a more meaningful thing to say, right? So you think about even what you're saying about children's TV, so there's the loneliness and the disorientation, but also you're in this hyper-competitive environment. And you think about one of the other factors that I write about in Lost Connections that I think is really playing out here, might have been playing out in your situation. So for thousands of years, philosophers have said, if you think life is about status and money and showing off, you're going to feel like shit, right? It's not exactly what Confucius said, but that's basically what he said, right?
Good translation.
Exactly. So I won't do the Chinese accent, I'll get immediately cancelled. But weirdly, no one had actually scientifically investigated this until an incredible man I got to know named Professor Tim Kasser. So he was the first person to actually scientifically investigate this intuition that philosophers had had. And he discovered loads of things, but the headline is, the philosophers were right. The more you think life is about money and status and showing off, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious by quite a significant amount, right? So think about the environment you were in, this hyper-competitive environment, this sort of where what's valued is getting ahead, you're constantly comparing yourself to other people. And this is an interesting thing about, in a way, the analogy I kept thinking about in relation to that is, so we all know junk food has taken over our diets and made us physically sick, right? But at the same time, a kind of junk values have taken over our minds and made us mentally sick, right? We've been taught that what life is about is competition, showing off, doing better than the person next to you, getting more likes, whatever it might be. We live in a culture where Donald Trump is probably going to be re-elected. Think about the values he represents, just in terms of that. And at some level, we all know there's something wrong with that, right? With those junk values. Because none of us are going to lie on our deathbed and think about all the likes we got on Instagram and all the shoes we bought. We're going to think about moments of love and meaning and connection. But we're fed a kind of, almost like a kind of KFC for the soul, right? We're taught from when we're very young. So think about you're this young guy, you're in your early 20s, and suddenly you're in this hyper-competitive junk values environment. And it's interesting because you said a really interesting sentence. It's something like, I won't get the words exactly right, but you said something like, everything was going well for me. And a lot of people say to me, well, there must be something biologically wrong with me because everything is going well for me, but I still feel bad.
That's exactly what I thought. I thought, well, there can't be an underlying thing here because my life is more successful than it's ever been.
Exactly.
Only 20 years later can I unpick it to realise that there were things going on.
Well, if you think about it, there's an analogy that helped me think about this. Everything was going well for you by the standards of the culture. But the standards of the culture can be wrong. There's a brilliant Bengali philosopher called Krishnamurti who said it's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society. And there's an analogy I think of, right? Think about something.
Say that again, please.
It's no sign of good health to be well adjusted to a sick society. And there's an analogy we can see from the recent past, from our mums' lives, right? So think about in the 1970s, there's a massive increase in women going to their doctors and getting Valium, right? Which was, if you don't know, was a tranquilizer, an unbelievably good tranquilizer, by the way, best drug in the world. I don't let myself take it ever again because I love it so much. And what was going on? One of the things that was going on is that loads of women were being beaten up by their husbands, right? There's been good research on this. And at the time, a lot of women, a lot of men clearly, and a lot of women thought in the culture, like my mum was from Glasgow. I was talking to one of your team about, he's from Glasgow as well, right? My mum was from Glasgow, although my mum wasn't beaten. In that culture, it was, in working class Glaswegian culture where my mother grew up, it was regarded as just part of the culture, a normal part of the culture that men beat up their wives, right? And it was devastating. And so you think about the 70s, you've got this moment when lots of women are being beaten up. Now, if we were able to go back in time and torture those women, we would say, you don't need Valium, you need to go to a battered wives shelter and you need to get away from this fucking man who's beating you up, right? You deserve to be not treated like this. You deserve better. But in the culture at the time, not many people were saying that, right? That was quite a rare thing to say. So those women would have said, well, I've got everything, right? I've got a husband who loves me, right? I've got everything. But now we look back and we go, all right, the culture in that respect was dysfunctional, right? It was telling you that you should be glad to have a husband who provides for you, even if he beats the shit out of you, in a way that we would never say that to a woman now, right? Even with all the regression we're making, we've not gone back to that, right? So in the same way, I think if we could go back to your 21-year-old self at CBBC or whatever, I think we might go, well, you're doing well by the standards of the culture, but is this culture really, are the values right?
Why though would those values make me anxious and depressed? Why is chasing the next job promotion causing us a problem? Why is wanting to have a better car than our friend that we see on Instagram causing us a problem? Why is comparison so deadly dangerous to us?
So I would separate out the first question you asked from the others. So why is wanting to get a job promotion? I think it very much depends on your motives. And it's another thing that Professor Kasser did, along with lots of other people, did a lot of research on. So if you think about, so let's imagine you play the piano. I'm completely unmusical, so this ain't me, but if you play the piano in the morning because you love it and it gives you joy, that's what's called an intrinsic motive to play the piano. You're not doing it to get anything out of it. You're doing it because you love it. It gives you pleasure, right? Okay, now imagine you play the piano not because you love it, but because your parents' dream for you is that you would be a piano maestro and they're hugely pressuring you. Or to post the clips on Instagram to get likes. Or, I don't know, maybe you're trying to impress a woman. Maybe there's some piano fetishist out there, right? That would be what's called an extrinsic reason to play the piano, right? You're not doing it because that thing gives you joy or meaning. You're doing it to get something out of it further down the line. And we're all a mixture of intrinsic and extrinsic motives. You have to be to get through the day. But what Professor Kasser showed is the more your life gets dominated by extrinsic motives, the more likely you are to become depressed and anxious. So think about when kids start using Instagram, right? They get very much into, it's just happening with my godsons now, where it's driving me crazy and really upsetting me. you start to think of your life through comparison. Right? I don't know, talking about my godsons. I love reading, right? I love reading books. And for a while, I would post on social media what book I'd read, right? I go, I love this book. And I thought, I'm doing a good thing here. I'm promoting this author. Aren't I a nice person? But I started to then you get reactions, right? Or I started to think, have I posted enough that I like this kind of author and not that kind of author? How am I making myself look? And it started to shift me from this intrinsic joy, I love to read, it started to become an extrinsic thing. I'll read this book so I get kudos. People go, isn't it impressive? I read this obscure Nigerian author or whatever it might be, right? So you can see, when we think about comparison puts us in the zone of extrinsic values, right? If you're doing something, look, if you want to have a nice car because you get the joy of driving and it feels great to you, that's totally fine. If you're doing it to invite the envy of other people, and we're all a lot more like that in this culture than we'd like to think. The way Professor Kasser put it to me is we live in a machine that is designed to get us to neglect what is important about life. From the moment we're born, we're soaking up these messages from advertising, from the culture, that are constantly locking us into this endless comparison, competition, tearing each other down, making each other jealous. And that is not the path to happiness. And at some level, we all know that, right? At some level, it's almost like a fucking Hallmark card, right? At some level, we know that. But the culture is constantly pulling us away from what we know intrinsically.
Which leads me to wonder on a stat, and I'd be interested in if you could help us answer it in somehow, Johann, about 1 in 3, I'll read it, that men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. And I'm interested in this sort of junk values culture. Do you think there's any connection with why that's the case?
Totally. I think there's a lot of things going on there. There's a lot. This is a very personal question to me, because we had a man in my family killed himself, a man in my very close family killed himself nearly 2 years ago. So I think there's lots of things going on here.
You're right.
Yeah. Sorry, I might get a glass of water actually, if you don't mind.
Look, by the way, I understand your emotion right around this. The family. My grandma committed suicide, and I think it leaves such a scar because the super pain here is it leaves all of us thinking, if only we'd have done more, if only something else could have happened. And I think that's why suicide is such a horrendous thing for society, because it deeply impacts the people around. Like, I'm more emotional now about that 20 years after it happened than I was at the time, strangely.
Why do you think that is?
I just think, well, I was a teenager. I was just cracking on with being a teenager. I had my A-level exams, and then life got busy. And now at 46, I think, man, the impact on my dad, or I now think, none of us were enough. Your grandkids, your children. It's very, very difficult, and that's the hard thing. It never leaves.
It's devastating, and it's. I think, in terms of why men have higher suicide rates, there's a few things we know. One is that men are far less likely to have friends. The number of men who have no friends is extraordinary. And so they're much more likely to be lonely. I think men are much more locked into junk values through no fault of their own. I think we also live in a culture, this is a more controversial point, and I would put it delicately. I think we live in a culture that makes a lot of men feel incompetent. I think we have a school system that is really bad for boys. It's not good for girls, but it's really shit for boys. We are the first society ever to try to get boys to sit still for 8 hours a day. That is crazy. And especially crazy that we get them to sit still for 8 hours a day to memorize meaningless shit for pointless tests that measure nothing. That is a bad system, right? And so I think there's so many factors going on with men, and a huge number of factors going on with women. And as I know you guys agree, it's not a contest, that we can. Every woman in Britain wants fewer men to kill themselves, and every man in Britain wants fewer women to kill themselves. And anyone who tries to pit us against each other is just being pointlessly conflictual and silly. But so I think there's lots of things going on with men. When you asked me that, and I was thinking about my relative, there's something I wish I. So sometimes people think, if you've learned all this, no one has said this to me so explicitly because they're not arseholes, but if you learned all this, why couldn't you help more? And obviously I've reflected a lot on what happened, and one of the things I wish I could have said to the person in my family who killed himself was, and I thought, what could I have said that would have stopped him? And weirdly, I think the thing I could have said that would have stopped him, of all the things I could have talked to him about all the solutions in my book, he'd read my book, right? I could have talked to him about all the solutions in my book. I could have done all that, and I, of course, did at great length. I wish I could have told him something that I think is one of the most important facts about suicide, and a very difficult and painful one, which is that suicide is contagious. If you kill yourself, you make it much more likely that other people you know will kill themselves. All forms of violence are contagious. In fact, murder is contagious, weirdly. Human beings are social animals and we take our signals. It's why you often get clusters of suicides, right? Remember in that town in Wales not that long ago, there was that dreadful, was it Bridgend? Horrific cluster of suicides. That's a real thing. It's why now...
You called it, like, was it like the Goethe effect? Is that the name of it?
Yeah, but named after Goethe, the great German... dramatist and novelist who wrote a novel called The Sorrows of Young Werther in the 18th century that described a suicide, and then there were then lots of kind of copies of that. It's why now, when a celebrity kills themselves, the media does not report how they did it, because it has we know this when Marilyn Monroe killed herself, there was then a bump in the suicide rate of people doing what she did. So this is a big factor, right? And my relative who killed himself was obviously in a state of profound despair. If he had known that it made it more likely that the kids in our family who we love were more likely to kill themselves further down the line, I don't think he would have done it. There's a thing about even when you can't love yourself, and he couldn't love himself, you can love someone else, right? And even at his lowest, he really, really loved his children. And I don't believe he would have taken a risk with his children's lives. And I knew that, and I didn't say it to him. And I really regret it. Of course, I can't guarantee it. Of course, if I think about all the things I could have said and done, that to me is the thing I suspect would have been the most effective. And we know this about lots of things that people, it's one of the beautiful things about human beings. We actually value other people more than we value ourselves. It's one other reason why junk values are so wrong. There's friends of mine at the who do research on voting methods, people like Dave Fleischer in Los Angeles, who did this beautiful pilot where they were trying to get people to vote. What makes people vote? And of course, the natural thing is you kind of go, oh, vote Labour and you'll get this level of childcare, or vote Conservative and you'll get this tax cut. I come to you and I say, you will get this benefit if you vote for this party, right? But they also piloted a different strategy, which is they said, you can only do this in the US as British people. We wouldn't do this on the doorstep. They say, tell me about someone you love. And you might go, you might tell me about your son or your nan or whatever. Go, okay, how would voting Labour or voting Conservative or whatever you want, how would that make your son's life better? How would it make your grandmother's life better? And you say to them, actually on Thursday, I would like you to vote for your son. Do this vote. And that was a much more effective getting out the vote strategy than giving people an individualistic reason to vote, right?
I'm going to tell you a secret that I've noticed about high performers. They are laser focused on the power of the gut. You heard me right, the gut. Because the gut and overall health are intrinsically linked. And that's why so many high performers take a probiotic. And one which keeps on being discussed is this, Biotic by Heights. Like, I've been taking it for over a year now, and it is so good. It's one of only 3 products in Europe that's Informed Sports certified. That means it's taken by Olympians, Premier League footballers, Guinness World Record holders, international rugby players. Quite simply, this is gut health for champions. So master your microbiome and treat yourself to a high-performing gut for a high-performance lifestyle with 20% off your first month. Just go to heights.com/HP or enter the code HP20 at checkout to get 20% off and start seeing the difference that Heights could make to your health.
It's really fascinating. So I think appealing to people's love for other people, we live in a culture, even think about the cliches we say about people, right? Be you, be yourself. We say to people, it's on I think it's literally on my fucking shampoo bottle, right? Be yourself, right? And I say about actually, don't be you. That's not, the problem is that you're you all the fucking time. The solution is actually be us, be part of the group. There was a person I interviewed for Lost Connections, brilliant academic called Dr. Brett Ford. I interviewed in Berkeley, but I think she's at the University of Toronto now. So she did this research with loads of other people. A really fascinating piece of research. So what they did is they wanted to figure out, let's imagine you decided you were going to spend an hour a day from now on trying consciously to be happier. They wanted to figure out, would it work? Would you actually become happier? And they did this research in 4 countries. It was the US, Russia, Taiwan, and Japan. And what they found at first seems really weird. In the US, if you try deliberately to become happier, you do not become happier. But in the other countries, if you try deliberately to become happier, on average, you do. There are exceptions on both sides, obviously. And they were like, oh, that's weird. What's going on? So they looked at it more. What they discovered was, in the US, I'm sure this is true mostly of us as well, if you try to make yourself happier, you do something for you. You do the values you were taught as a children's TV presenter.
Of course, yeah.
Try to get a promotion, work harder, buy something, treat yourself, show it off on Instagram, make other people go, OMG, so jealous. You do you, right? In the other cultures, Russia, Taiwan, and Japan, in the main, if you tried to make yourself happier, you did something for someone else. You did something for your friends, your family, your community. So the fancy way of putting it is we have an instinctively individualistic idea of what it means to be happy, and they have an instinctively collective idea of what it means to be happy. And our theory of happiness just doesn't work, right? A species of isolated individualists would have died out on the savannas of Africa. They would not have banded together and survived. I always think individualism is a bit like what Winston Churchill said about communism, was meant to have said, a bit apocryphal. He said, communism is a great theory. They just got the wrong species. It works very well for ants. And I kind of think individualism, great theory, but we ain't that species. That's not us. That's not our instincts. That's not who we are. But we're constantly trained to be individualists, right?
Yeah.
So how do we solve this then? Because we know the numbers and the stats, right? We understand that men particularly are killing themselves more than ever before. We know there's a mental health crisis on every level. Yet we're still in the world that's causing the problem. So how do we as individuals, how do the people watching and listening to this conversation, how can we begin the tidal wave of change to solve this?
Because the whole second half of Lost Connections is about this, and because I think it's the absolutely key question. I'm not actually that interested in intellectual diagnosis of problems unless it leads to a solution, right? So I think the first thing is once you reframe the problem, so the first thing is we say to someone who's depressed and anxious, not, there's something wrong, what my doctor said to me, lovely doctor, by the way, good person, well-intentioned, but my doctor said to me, there's something wrong with your brain, you just need to drug yourself. What that did is it made me doubt the signal I was receiving, or in fact, not even doubt it, completely disregard it, right?
My doctor said you need to stop working on television and move back to Norwich and do a job less stressful. That's what they thought the solution was.
Interesting. It's slightly less mad than my doctor.
It
but,
is.
Although I can imagine Norwich, quite depressing. Sorry.
Greatest place in the world.
No, just
Says the man who lives in Vegas.
Exactly, the world's most depressing place. But when you reframe the problem, you begin, so instead of saying something wrong with your brain, we start to say, okay, you've got unmet needs. How can we support you? How can we help you to get those deeper needs met? There's lots of ways to do that and lots of levels at which we can do it. But so some of them are very local, things you can do as an individual, and some things, are bigger things that we have to do as a society. So I'll give you an example of a small thing. Professor Kasser, who made those breakthroughs, also made this other really interesting breakthrough. So there was a guy called Nathan Dungan, who was a financial advisor in Minneapolis. And one day he got approached by a school, kind of middle-class school. And they said, look, we've got a big problem. Will you come in and talk to the kids? And the problem they had was loads of the kids were getting obsessed with getting the latest Nike sneakers or the latest iPhone. If they weren't getting it, they were going mental. And it was causing problems at the school and problems at home. They said, will you just come in and teach these kids about budgeting and what their parents can afford? So he comes in, he gives them a load of lessons about budgeting, and quickly discovers these kids don't give a shit about budgeting. They just be like, whatever, I need the fucking sneakers, right? Yeah. So he learned about Professor Kasser's research and thought, actually, what's happened here is something's gone wrong with their values, not just with, their understanding of how much their parents can afford. So him and Professor Kasser did this really interesting experiment. If I remember rightly, details are in the book. It's every couple of weeks for quite a few months, the kids came in with their parents. And they sat together in groups. And the first time they met, the group, Nathan said to the group, just write a list of everything you've got to have. And he said, I'm not going to define that for you, just whatever you think that means, right? Yeah. And at first they obviously everyone says like, we've got to have water and food and that. But quite quickly, people started saying things you've not got to have, like the latest iPhone. And the parents were the same. They would name like expensive shit, right? And then he said to them, okay, they go down to that thing on the list, not water or whatever. And they say, okay, tell me how your life would be better if you got this thing. How would your life change? So let's say Nike sneakers. What was interesting is none of the kids said, oh, I'm a basketball player, and if I get these sneakers, I'll be able to jump higher. No one said that. They said things like, well, if I get these sneakers, other people will want me to be part of their group, or other people will envy me. You need to get people to say that out loud before they realize, oh, why does having a shitty plastic tick on my shoe, that's not what's going on here. What's going on here is I want to be part of a group, right? So it was a little bit of sort of deconstructing their junk values, but the next bit is what I think was really most important. Then they would say, write about a moment in your life when you've had a feeling of meaning and connection. And different people would describe different things, moments at work, when they helped someone, being on the beach with their kids, learning to play the guitar, whatever it might be. And then they said to them, okay, how can you build more of your life around pursuing these moments of meaning and connection and less around this shit you don't need that doesn't make you feel good, right? And then literally just every couple of weeks, they came and had that conversation. They talked about what they'd done the previous 2 weeks, because we're living in a culture that's constantly diverting us towards the bullshit. Yeah. So just meeting, we don't have these conversations in our culture, right? Just meeting and going, I could have spent all that time, working extra hours to buy this handbag and making my friends jealous, but instead I spent it with my daughter or learning French or whatever it might be, right? So it was almost like a kind of Alcoholics Anonymous for the bullshit values we're given as a culture, right? And what was fascinating was just having those conversations led to a really marked shift in people's values, which we know correlates with lower depression and anxiety. So after I learned this, one thing we do it once a month. For a long time, we had to do it over Zoom for obvious reasons because of the pandemic. But me and 3 of my friends, we have a Zoom and we just have that conversation because it is so easy to get diverted onto bullshit.
And tell us again the questions you ask each other.
So we talk about, I'll give you an example from my own life, right? So I'm talking to you, I've just had a new book out, right?
Yeah.
Which is called Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs, just so my publicist doesn't taser me when we get out of this. And see, even saying that, right, even though I made a little joke of it, when you have a book out, there's part of you that becomes driven by these values. Like, how is it selling? What are people saying, right? And I've had times when that goes really well and my books have sold 1 million copies and times when they don't sell so well. But I've got to tell you, even when it goes brilliantly and when it goes not so well, it's never a feeling of satisfaction, and you get a kind of high when it does well, a very, very short-acting high, I have to say. But you get into that zone of those values, it makes you egotistical, it makes you more narcissistic. All through the process of my book coming out, I've had to be really anchored with a group of friends of mine in what can I do that is for someone who isn't me, right? That isn't benefiting me, that isn't aggrandizing me. So I was in Jamaica for 3 months, kind of off the grid. It's a different story. I was doing some research for something at the end of last year and the start of this year. And me and a group of my friends, we met this amazing kid in Jamaica. And so we've been together doing a lot to help him, and because he's in a very difficult situation. And anchoring myself in that thing that's not about you, that's not serving you, aggrandizing yourself, feeding your ego, something that actually doesn't help me in my, in any kind of direct, beyond just the goodness of feeling you've helped another human being, right? That has been so much more meaningful than all the buzzy stuff, right? So, but again, think about how little in our culture we're encouraged to do that, right? So I would say we meet and we just talk about what did we do this month that was meaningful? And in retrospect, what did we do that was bullshit, that was chasing the stuff that isn't meaningful? right? And if you don't have that conversation, just having that abstract insight, look, I know that. If I'm not anchored and I then think ahead to it, I think, oh, well, Jess is going to say that if I do this. Oh no, I want to make sure, so you want to be anchored in these meaningful values. And the way you get anchored in meaning of any kind, it's very hard to sustain meaning on your own, right? Very hard.
Yeah.
Some people can do it to some degree, but it becomes 1,000 times easier in a group, right? Meaning is contagious, just like suicide, the loss of meaning is contagious, right? So so that's one thing. I'm going to go through loads of things in the book. We can talk about plenty more, but that's one of the things. But I actually think the cruelest thing we do about depression and anxiety is put the onus of solving it solely on the depressed individual who's least able to do that. We don't do that about car crashes, right? So as a society, we know, okay, car crashes are terrible. So we have seatbelts, we have airbags, we have A&E, we have all these things that solve the problem of... We don't say the job of solving car crashes is on a guy who's just being cut out of a mangled wreck on the M25, right? We don't do that. That would be crazy. But it's like we put the job of solving depression solely on the depressed person. Now, there are lots of things depressed and anxious people can do that I go through in my book, Lost Connections. But we've got to be doing it much more as a society, as a group, right? Because the truth is, if you're depressed and anxious, something did not primarily go wrong for you as an individual. Of course, there are individual psychological factors, and I go through them in the book, and especially about releasing shame around trauma. There are lots of important psychological factors. Of course, there are biological factors. But the reason depression and anxiety have increased, you've got to see the connection between all these things that are happening. The best definition of depression I was ever given was by a wonderful, incredible British woman called Dr. Tyrrell Harris, who made a series of breakthroughs in the 1970s on depression, world-changing discoveries along with Professor George Brown. She said to me, best definition of depression is very simple. Everyone experiences hopelessness sometimes. Depression is when that hopelessness spreads over your whole life like an oil slick, right? And we are seeing these indicators of despair all over the developed world. It's not a coincidence. And there's many indicators of despair. My first book, Chasing the Scream, is about addiction. If you look at, there's a brilliant pair of scientists called Professor Anne Case and Professor Angus Dayton who've shown, if you look at suicide, addiction, depression, violence, they all cluster in the same places, right? They're all highest in the same places. By the way, so is support for Trump. In the same place, it's support for far-right political parties in France, right? They all cluster in those places as well. Those are symptoms of despair. It's why it's so unhelpful to call those people stupid or racist or insult them. That is not the way we get out of this, right? Although, of course, I would ask them not to make the choice they've made. The way you do that is not by insulting them and mocking them and being cruel to them.
It exasperates the problem.
Yeah, well, it's fucking cruel for a start.
Yeah.
Don't be cruel to suffering people.
Yeah.
And secondly, yeah, you're absolutely right.
It adds to their feeling
exactly.
of despair.
And they're not wrong. If we're calling them losers, fuck me.
And these questions, just one quick thing. Like let's say here on High Performance, right, there's almost 20 people that work on this show. And really, we just talk about the show. We talk about work. We talk about the next guest. We talk about the KPIs, the targets. So we should be having this kind of a conversation, shouldn't we, once a week as a team? Like, what have we done this week that's not for show, that's purely for us as individuals?
I would really recommend it. And for me, it was a real shift that I made in my own life, because before, I'm as much of a product of this culture as anyone. When I would feel these feelings coming of depression, anxiety, what I would do is I would double down on external achievement, right? I'm someone who's, I was good at exams, I've done well in my jobs. I would sort of double down on I must work harder to get this achievement, to get that, to get this, to do that. And now there's still a big part of me that's like that. And there's a part of me that's driven intrinsically. I'd like to think I write my books because the questions I ask are meaningful, but there's also a bit of me that's extrinsic and ego, of course. But now I also try to have a really big part of me that when I feel that coming, think, okay, what can I do for someone else now? And very often, I'm not Oprah, I can't turn up and give them a car, but very often the best thing you can do for someone in such a lonely and isolated culture, leave your fucking phone at home and go and sit and listen to someone. And really sit and listen to them and think about what they're saying and look into their eyes. That is the biggest gift you can give anyone, right? And very often when you can't feel good about yourself, you can still make someone else feel good, right? It's a surprising thing. It comes back to the thing about, your vote is a gift you give to someone you love. When you can't summon your energy or strength to do something for yourself, you often can. The most depressed parent in the world will get up to save their child's life, right? You can usually do something for someone else, even when you can't do it for yourself.
And thinking about that message about doing it for somebody else, and my next question is prompted by that great example of how do you get people to vote, think about doing it for your kids. It's a bit of a selfish question of, in a time of junk values, how do we help our children get out of this? Because I have the issue with my son where he's on a phone, and our decision to give him the phone was about the social connection of that's what all his friends were doing, so how does he keep in touch? And yet I can also see that the apps, Snapchat, Instagram, the different things, are dragging him into the swamp of a comparison culture of looking at the things that we recognise are not healthy and don't lead to long-term happiness. What advice would you give to any parents listening or watching today, Johann, about how we can start to influence the next generation to maybe break this cycle?
Yeah, so I wrote a book about this, as you know, called Stolen Focus, Why You Can't Pay Attention. And as you're saying that, flashed a moment in my mind. So I spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley interviewing the people who designed the stuff your kids are using, right? I'll never forget, there's a guy called Dr. James Williams who'd worked at the heart of Google. And one day he spoke to a tech conference the audience is literally the people who design the apps that your kids are using right now. And he said to them, he was feeling really uneasy, he said, if there's anyone here who wants to live in the world that we're creating, please put up your hand. And nobody put up their hand. And not long after, he quit and became, I would argue, one of the most important philosophers of attention in the world. He's at Oxford now, you should have him on, he's a brilliant guy. And this is something I kept seeing with the people in Silicon Valley. In fact, one of the most striking things about them, the people who designed this world, is how sick with guilt and shame they feel about what they've done. And I'll sort of unpack that a bit, but you're absolutely right. Instagram, TikTok, these are machines designed to get people into comparison mode, right? One of the first things your son will notice when he posts something on Instagram is, how many likes did I get, right? What do people say on TikTok? So if you wanted to supercharge these values, this is the machinery you would design, as indeed it has. So I go through in Stolen Focus 9 factors that are harming our attention, causing these problems. And for all of them, except for one, there's sort of 2 levels at which we've got to deal with this, I think. I think of it as defense and offense. So there are loads of things that we've got to do as individuals to protect ourselves and our children from these factors that are harming us, right? And I'll talk about some in a second. But I want to be really honest with people, because I do not think most people who communicate about these problems are leveling with people. I'm passionately in favour of these individual changes. They will make a really big difference. They've made a big difference in my life, in my godson's lives, in my nephew's lives. They're really important. On their own, they will not fully solve the problem, because the truth is, this didn't happen because your son had bad habits or I had bad habits. This happened because a fucking massive machinery designed by unbelievably clever people is systematically targeting and undermining us, right? As my friend Johann Hari said when he testified before the Senate, he was also at the heart of the machine. You can try having self-control, but every time you do, there are 10,000 engineers on the other side of the screen trying to undermine your self-control, right? So when you think about that, we talk about the personal stuff you can do first. So I would recommend every parent do 3 things. First thing is several things. I mean, I go through loads in the book, but I could list like 20, but I'll just stick to a few. First thing is buy something called a K-safe. I should have brought it along as a demonstration. It's plastic safe. You take off the lid, you put in your phone, you put on the lid, you turn the dial, push the button, and it locks your phone away for anything between 5 minutes and a whole day. So what I recommend about the K-safe is everyone with kids, and this is going to be a long process, right? It's not going to happen, it's not going to be solved overnight. Just start with all of you putting your phones in the K-safe for 15 minutes a night. And you have to actually look into each other's eyes, like in the olden times. And they will reject it at first. But the thing I always say to people about attention is think about anything you've ever achieved in your life that you're proud of, whether it's, starting a business, being a good parent, learning to play the guitar, whatever it is, that thing that you're proud of required a huge amount of sustained focus and attention, right? Focus and attention are at the heart of all human achievement. When you can't focus or pay attention, your ability to achieve your goals diminishes, your ability to solve your problems diminishes, and when you get it back, it's like regaining your superpower. So I would frame it to them like that. And if attention is our superpower, you are surrounded by kryptonite, right? So I would start with that. Like, just use the K-Safe 15 minutes a day, gradually stretch it a bit more. It's difficult at first, but the pleasures of someone actually listening to you and paying attention to you is so much greater than whatever shitty update you're going to miss on TikTok for 15 minutes, right? So start with that, build it into your collective routine, because it's no good you standing over your kids saying, use your phone less while you're staring at your own devices, right? Secondly, I would say install on your phone, your laptop, and your kids' phones and laptops an app called Freedom. Very simple app. So let's say you were addicted to, Instagram, Pornhub. Well, I indicated to you Pornhub at that point.
How did you know?
Someone got a text. I mean, it has been playing throughout this entire interview, but didn't want to let you know. Whatever it is, right? Let's say you've got one particular website you're addicted to.
Yeah.
You can say to it, no, I'm not looking again. You can say, block me from that website for the next 5 minutes, the next whole day, however long it'll be. Or you can say, block me from the entire internet for the next 5 minutes, the next 24 hours. And once you push the button, if you try to go to that website, it will just say, you have been set free, and you can't look at it anymore. So I permanently, on my phone, have blocked all social media, because I do not want people to sit at my funeral, stand up and go, yeah, Johann spent a lot of time on Instagram, right? So I have an assistant who does it sounds very fancy, but I have an assistant who does my social media.
So do you ever go on there, look at updates and see what's going on? Or?
Well, I found just in the last week, so I had to get it unblocked on my phone because I did an Instagram live with Davina McCall, and I didn't put the blocker back on. So I spent a week where, again, I was like, I'll just use it for 5 minutes a day. And yesterday I was on it for an hour, and I was like, fucking block it again. So I've blocked it again, right? Because it's very hard to... This is a phenomenon called pre-commitment. Pre-commitment is when you know you want to do something in the future, but you also know you're going to crack, right? So we just had a break, and you and me had an Oreo. I do not allow Oreos in my house. I will never buy them because I know I will wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and stuff my fucking face with Oreos, right? Yeah. Even on Ozempic as I am, it will still happen, right? So my form of pre-commitment is I never bring it into my house, right? So I buy, the Johann in the supermarket knows that Johann at 2 a.m. is not going to be as strong as he is now, so I don't let it. So it's a form of pre-commitment. Freedom is another form of pre-commitment. So download Freedom, sync it to your phone and app, give them an hour a day. Thirdly, I would say buy them a light phone. It's about 200 quid. It's not cheap, but a light phone is a phone that it's a phone. You can call people on it. You can have, I think it's 200 songs. You can have maps, but you cannot get onto the internet, right? So again, let them have their smartphone. I would say build up so that eventually the ideal is we don't want to get rid of technology, obviously. They should have their smartphone for an hour, maybe 90 minutes a day. The rest of the time it lives in the K-Safe, and the rest of the time they have a light phone, right? Because light phone, they've still got, you can still do the chat, group chats. My godsons have this. They're not completely cut off, but you're not living in some weird Amish land where you never get, you don't get that connection. So yeah, I would say those are 3 things you should do immediately as individuals, but we've also got to do the big social stuff, which I'm happy to talk about.
Can I ask you a question as Johann Hari, the individual, not Johann Hari, the expert, right? Quite a while ago, you mentioned your godsons. And you said, I'm worried about, and then you went, I'm actually really worried about them. And then quickly said, I don't know why I'm talking about them, and moved on, right? How worried are you about their use of technology, and how worried should we be about our kids' use of technology?
Oh, profoundly worried. They're being hacked and invaded by extremely sophisticated people who have their own set of motives for our kids, which are not our motives. And I think that really connects up to the other thing I was going to say, which is the social component. If you want to understand what I just said, because it sounds a bit weird or even conspiratorial, I kept interviewing people in Silicon Valley, and they kept explaining this to me. The core of what's happening here with this element, there's 9 factors that are harming our attention. This is only one of them. It's obviously one of the biggest. And it took me quite a long time for it to land, because I kept saying, how can this be right? So they kept explaining to me, bear in mind, these are people who'd worked at the heart of these companies. They said to me, if you open now Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, or X, whatever the fuck we're meant to call it now, right? Those companies begin to make money out of you immediately in two ways. The first way is really obvious. You see advertising. Okay, everyone knows how that works. The second way is much more important. Everything you ever do on these apps, including your so-called private messages, is scanned and sorted by their artificial intelligence algorithms to figure out who you are and what makes you tick. What makes you happy, what makes you sad, what makes you horny, what makes you angry. They're learning all of that. So let's say you've ever indicated in any of these messages that you like, I don't know, Nigel Farage, Bette Midler, and you told your mum you just bought some nappies. Okay, it's going to figure out if you like Nigel Farage, you're probably right-wing. If you like Bette Midler and you're a man, you're probably gay. No disrespect to any straight men who like Bette Midler, I don't actually believe you. And you bought some nappies, okay, you've had a baby, right? So if you've been on these apps for a while, they know tens of thousands of things about you, right? Vastly more than many of your friends, because your friends aren't reading all your messages at 3 a.m., right? And it's harvesting that information for several reasons, but the most important is it's figuring out what to show you next that will keep you scrolling, right? That is the key thing it is learning. And it's learning that for a crucial reason. Every time you open the app and begin to scroll, they begin to make money. The longer you scroll, the more money they make because the more ads you see. Every time you close the app, that revenue stream disappears. Every time your kid opens the app and begins to scroll, they begin to make money. Every time your kid closes the app, that revenue stream disappears. So all of this genius in Silicon Valley, when it's applied to social media, all this AI, all these algorithms, are geared towards literally one thing, figuring out how do we get you to open the app as often as possible and scroll as long as possible. That's it. And the people at the heart of the machine who'd been there, I kept saying, well, it must be more complicated than that. And they were like, the head of KFC might be a perfectly nice man or woman, right? And may care about many things. But in his or her professional capacity, they care about one thing. How often did you go to KFC this week and how big was the bucket you bought? That's it. I don't give a shit about anything else, right? If they cared about anything else and they started acting on it, they'd get fired and be replaced by someone who only cared about how much chicken you bought. In the same way, these are machines designed to harvest our attention. And they are getting better and better at it, right? Paul Graham is one of the biggest investors in Silicon Valley, said that the world will be more addictive in the next 40 years than it was in the last 40 on this current trajectory. Think about how much more addictive TikTok is to your kid than Snapchat was, or certainly than Facebook was, right? So imagine these crack-like iterations that are coming out. So at first when you hear that, especially when you hear it from the people at the heart of it all, I thought, well, fuck, we're just screwed then. It's like we're living in the Matrix.
That's what I'm thinking, can we ever win?
So what's really important to understand about that is there is a solution, a really important solution, and there's an analogy that happened in our lifetimes that I think really helps us to get to this solution. So if you want to understand what we've got to do about this that gets us out of this matrix like we're trapped thing, we've got to understand that there are basically 3 ways you can fund social media, right? There's 3 models. There's the one we've got now. The fancy technical term for it is surveillance capitalism, which comes from Professor Shoshana Zuboff, brilliant person at Harvard. So basically, what happens now is you and your kids appear to get TikTok and Instagram for free, right? You don't pay anything up front, but you pay with your attention, with your time, and I would argue with our democracy, though, remind me to come back to that, a pretty important thing. So you're not paying up front, but you're being harvested, and your attention is being sold to the highest bidder. You know, these companies, they've all got customer service departments. We can't phone them. You try ringing the customer service department, they won't talk to you, right? Because we're not the customer. We're the product they sell to the real customer who's the advertiser, right? So that's one model. There's some benefits to that. You don't pay up front. That's something, right? People's budgets are tight. I don't sniff at that. But you pay with a huge number of other things, right? So that's one model. The second model is something that I'm guessing pretty much everyone watching has some experience of. It's very simple. It's subscription. Think about Netflix. You pay a small amount, in return you get access. The key thing to understand about a subscription-based model, so you would pay a small amount to get on, is all the incentives change in a subscription-based model. In a surveillance capitalism model, the model is, how do I hack and invade you in order to keep you scrolling as long as possible. Because you're not the customer, you're the product. Suddenly in a subscription model, you actually are the customer. Suddenly they have to go, oh, what do you want? Turns out you feel good when you sit opposite people face to face and talk to them in the real world, not when you doom scroll through their photoshopped images. Okay, let's design our app to maximize meeting offline. You can design the app so it pings. If you've turned it on, Bob's up the road. Bob wants to have a coffee. Do you want to have a coffee with Bob? My friends in Silicon Valley could design in a day a set of social media that's designed to maximize offline engagement that would make us all feel better, right? But you have to change the incentives to get to that, right? If the longer you scroll, the more money they make, they're going to discourage you from meeting up offline and keep you doom scrolling, which is what they do. So that's second model, subscription. The third model is one that literally everyone has experience of. The fancy term for it is public ownership independent of government. Think about the sewers. Before we had sewers, we had shit in the streets, people got cholera, it was terrible. So actually, just up the road from where we are now, first sewers were built. We all live in London. We own the sewers in London together with all the other citizens of London, and we pay to maintain the sewers together, right? Because we don't want to get cholera and all the other stuff you get when you don't have sewers. It might be that just like we want to own the sewage pipes because we don't want to get cholera, we might want to own the information pipes together because we don't want to get cholera for our attention, for our democracy, right? Now, you want to be very careful that would have to be independent of the government. We can all imagine what it'd be like if, an authoritarian leader owned the pipes of the internet. That's not what we want. So I would argue we need to move from surveillance capitalism to either subscription or some kind of public ownership independent of government, right? Now, if that sounds very kind of fancy and like, oh, good luck to that, I would give an analogy that from our lifetimes, right, that we can remember. So when we were kids, the only form of petrol you could get was leaded petrol, right? I'm sure you remember, your parents putting it in the car. And it was discovered by scientists that exposure to lead is extremely bad for people's brains and particularly bad for children's ability to focus and pay attention, right? And obviously, if it's in the petrol, it's in fumes, everyone was breathing in huge levels of lead. It's why there was a big spike in many of these problems. Actually, a big spike in violence because exposure to lead disinhibits people and makes them more violent. It's why the murder rate went up in the 70s, because there was such a big increase in lead exposure. So what happened was a group of ordinary mums, what at the time would have called themselves housewives, led by an amazing woman called Jill Rounette, banded together and said, why are we allowing this? Why are we allowing the lead industry to fuck up our kids' brains? They probably didn't say fuck up, they weren't as sweary as me, but whatever. Why are we allowing this? And it's really important to notice what those mums didn't say. They didn't say, so let's ban petrol, let's get rid of cars, let's go back to living in the 19th century. No one said that. Just like none of us are saying, let's get rid of technology, let's all convert to the Amish. That's not what we want, right? I'm pro-tech, right? What they said is, let's get rid of the specific kind of petrol that's screwing up our kids' brains and replace it with a kind of petrol that won't fuck up our kids' brains. And it followed their fight. That was a really difficult fight. They had to fight for years, and it followed the classic pattern of all political fights that was described by Mahatma Gandhi. First they ignored them, then they laughed at them, then they fought them, then they won. As we know, ain't no more leaded petrol anywhere in the world. Venezuela just became the last country to get rid of it in the whole world. As a result, the average British child is 3 to 5 IQ points higher than they would have been had we not banned leaded petrol. Now, to me, that's a really great model, in addition to all the individual stuff that I go through in my book, Stolen Focus, that we should do, and there are dozens and dozens of things I talk about that we can do immediately. We've also, because I really want to level with people, because I don't feel most people who are talking about this crisis are leveling with people. There's an analogy I always think of. It's a bit of a distasteful analogy, but when you hear these tech people promoting meditation or whatever, to me, it's like someone is leaning over and pouring itching powder over us all day. And then they're saying, you know what, mate, you should learn how to meditate. Then you wouldn't be scratching all the time. And you want to go, all right, I'll learn to meditate. Very valuable. I'm in favor of that. But you've got to stop pouring this fucking itching powder over me, right? So these individual solutions are important, but in the scale of the level of profound disruption to our attention and thought that is happening, they're pretty feeble, our individual solutions. They're important, I do them, they make my life better, but we've got to also have and I slightly jokingly call it an attention rebellion. But I absolutely think we've got to do that, and we can do that. And I went to countries that have started to do it, from France to New Zealand, countries that have begun to take these steps. And absolutely, we can do this, right? I would argue we have to do it. We can't continue, for every one child who was identified with serious attention problems when we were 7 years old, there's now 100 children who've been identified with that problem today. The average office worker now focuses on any one task for less than a minute, right? There is a lot indicating we're in a serious attention crisis. The solutions are there. We can do it. We have to do it. And when governments have stood up, it has worked. I can give examples, but so we don't have to accept this being done to us and our children. There are lots of practical steps. Also, you talk about what parents can do. Absolutely fight to get smartphones out of your kids' schools. Do not allow them. In places that have done that, and I interviewed the scientists who studied this in Spain, in Norway. I went to schools that have done it in California, all over the world. The evidence is very clear. You get a massive improvement in learning and a massive fall in bullying, right? I can explain why the bullying if you want, but so absolutely we can do this. We don't have to tolerate our kids being put up with this. But the first thing we have to do, I think at the moment we're in this sort of zone where we're like, oh, this is bad, but it's just the modern world. It's just, doesn't it suck to be like this, right? But isn't it bad the world went in this direction? No, it didn't have to go in this direction. It doesn't have to continue going in this direction. We can sort this out. We can fix this. And, this is in the interests of everyone, right? With the possible exceptions of Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk, we have a constituency of everyone who wants to solve this problem. And by the way, even Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg would be happier if we sorted this out. Maybe they'd be a little bit less rich, but they'll be okay, right? They're not going to be under a bridge. It'll be all right.
So tell us about the bullying one.
Oh, so there's a really interesting thing that's going on. It's a funny thing. It links up both individual bullying and the crisis in democracy in a funny way. So like I said, if you open these apps now and begin to scroll, they begin to make money and they want you to scroll longer and longer. So the algorithms are designed to figure out, how do we get you to keep scrolling? They're agnostic about what they show you next. They don't care specifically what it is. All they want is for you to keep scrolling. So the algorithms are trained on literally 3 billion people, figure out what keeps people scrolling. And those algorithms bumped into an underlying truth about human psychology that's actually been known about for, 80 years now. So it's called negativity bias. It's very simple. Human beings will stare longer at things that make us angry or upset than we will at things that make us feel good, right? If you've ever seen a car crash on the motorway, you know what I mean. You stared longer at the mangled wreck than you did at the pretty flowers on the other side of the street. This is very deep in human nature. 10-week-old babies will stare longer at an angry face than a smiling face. It's probably for a deep evolutionary reason. Our ancestors who weren't looking out for the angry faces, got eaten and didn't get to be our ancestors, right? That's a slightly crude way of putting it, but you get the point, right? And that's always been part of our nature. But when it combines with algorithms that learn specifically what pisses you off, what you care about, what makes you angry, it leads to a horrendous effect. So imagine you've got two teenage girls who go to the same party and leave and go home on the same bus. And they both open their phones and do a TikTok video. And one of them says, we had a great night. We danced to Ariana Grande. I fucking loved it, right? That video will go into some people's feeds. The algorithms are always scanning the kind of language you use. Put it into a few people's feeds, a few people will see it. Imagine the second girl opens a video, makes the video and says, Karen was an absolute skank at that party, and her boyfriend's I don't know if teenagers still say skank.
Might be.
I think I'm dating
wouldn't know,
myself.
would we?
Exactly. Well, let's rehabilitate the word skank. But, her boyfriend's a prick and just does an angry rant about everyone at the party. Because it's scanning the words you use, the algorithms know if it's enraging, it's engaging, right? If it makes you angry and upset, more people will look at it. More people will look at it for longer and more people will engage. You go, what do you mean Karen's a skank? You're a fucking skank. They'll have an argument. They'll have a fight, right? I'd like to think that what I'm saying to you is interesting now, but if outside that door that we can see through, if someone started having a fight, you would definitely stop listening to me and watch the fight, right? So you can see how that incentive is having a catastrophic effect in algorithms designed to show you the thing that will keep you scrolling, right? So it is showing people things that make them angry, upset, hurt. You could then begin to see why in schools that banned smartphones, there was less bullying. because the kids are, for at least 8 hours a day, taken out of that nexus where the mean comments are given a megaphone and pushed to the front, and the kind comments are muffled and pushed to the back. Now, that is bad enough at the level of 2 teenage girls on a bus. We all know what's happened to teenage girls' mental health. My friend, Professor Jonathan Haidt, has done amazing work on this. But now imagine that being applied to a whole country, except you don't have to imagine it, because we're speaking a few days after the French just gave the largest vote to the far right since the literal Vichy government that collaborated with the Nazis. And we're speaking, what is it, a month after the second biggest winner in the European elections in Germany was Alternative for Deutschland, who are literally the inheritors of the Nazis. And we're speaking 3.5 months, 4 months before Donald Trump is likely to be re-elected as president. So we're living in a dynamic where the cruelest people are being pumped up and promoted, and the people who say, let's not hate each other. Yeah, we might disagree on some important things, but we still all live together and we still love each other and we still got things to value. Those people get muffled. And don't take my word for it. In 2016, after the election of, after the Brexit vote and the election of Donald Trump, Facebook set up a group of its own data scientists to figure out, God, did we play a role in this? They didn't tell us they'd done this. We only know this because a brilliant whistleblower leaked it. And their own data scientists said that the Facebook algorithms maximizing engagement by maximizing anger had massively promoted far-right material. In fact, a third of all the people in Germany who joined a far-right group joined because the Facebook algorithm specifically recommended it. You might want to join, it said, followed by a far-right group. And Facebook's own scientists said, we just have to abandon our current business model because our current business model inherently promotes hatred, right? And Mark Zuckerberg disbanded the group and told them to never bring him any findings like that ever again. So you see, it's interesting, such an interesting thing when I did the research for Stolen Focus, that when you start looking at attention, it seems like a small thing. Oh, I'm distracted. It takes me longer to get things done than it used to. But then you realize at every level of our lives, in our children's lives, in our own lives, in work, in our offices, and at the highest levels, these factors are screwing over our ability to be who we want to be, actually to achieve high performance, right? Good luck achieving your highest performance in a society where the rule of law is unraveling, where basic democratic ideas are unraveling. You know, we've really got to deal with these underlying factors. And the good news is that we can, that there are solutions, that they're very practical, they're not fancy, they're based on things that have improved all of our lives in the past. But we've got to really acknowledge, God, we're in a crisis, right? All the smoke alarms are going off. It's time to, just like we were saying, we've got to listen to the signal on depression, we've also got to listen to these signals.
Really powerful. Look, Johann, we've reached the point in the interview for our quickfire questions.
Oh, yes, right. Okay, quickfire. I'm not good at this.
I bet you are.
Okay, let's do it.
Okay. The 3 non-negotiable behaviours that you think are most important.
In human beings generally, be curious about other people, listen to people, be kind to them.
Lovely. That was quick, see?
Okay, they've done it.
Very well done.
There's a lot more.
Okay.
What's the single best piece of advice you've ever received and why?
From my grandmother. She said, never let anyone think they're worth more than you and never let anyone think they're worth less than you.
And why is that so important?
Because no one is worth more than you or less than you. Every person you ever meet knows loads of things you don't know and has had all these unique experiences. And when people behave badly, it's because of things that have happened to them that are also interesting and that you can understand and empathize with. So I think if you can approach people with a spirit of like openness and curiosity, you know, I don't know if this is actually true. I was told this by someone in Melbourne Zoo. Apparently, koalas only recognize eucalyptus leaves, which is the only thing they eat, if they're held above them. So a koala will literally starve to death in a room full of eucalyptus leaves if they're just on the floor. And I sort of weirdly feel that we're a bit like that with other people in that if you realize that everyone around you is really interesting and has amazing stories and insights, the world is like infinitely abundant. It's like fascinating, right? How interesting are other human beings? And if you get cut off in this egotistical culture where you think, oh, it's the interesting thing is me droning on about myself all the fucking time, You're like the koala starving to death in the room full of eucalyptus leaves, right? I've never actually said that analogy publicly. I'm not sure it totally works.
I'm nicking it.
Yeah, it's the horrible
if you don't
fuckers, though,
mind.
koalas, bastards. Don't trust them.
It works.
Yeah.
If you could give your 14-year-old self one piece of advice, what would it be?
Would it be? Your pain makes sense. The reasons you're distressed are totally understandable. There's nothing wrong with you. There's something wrong with what's being done to you. And you can get help for that.
What's your greatest strength and your biggest weakness?
My greatest strength is probably that I really like other people. I almost never dislike anyone I actually meet. So I think whatever the opposite of misanthropy is, I suppose it would be philanthropy, but we call that means something else. I really, really like people, and I have a lot of energy for listening to people, and I'm very curious about them. My biggest weakness is probably, it's a function of a strength, but it's the downside of a strength. So I'm good at telling stories and structuring stories. And when you're good at that, particularly if you're a writer, it can have a weird effect where you become quite distanced from your own life and the people around you. So we were talking before about, for the last, how many years, since 2011, I've been working on a book about a series of crimes that are happening in Las Vegas. Well, I've got to know some absolutely incredible people over the last 13 years. And there's a thing where, Vegas is a particularly weird environment anyway, but where you can be so in the mode of thinking of it as a story that you sort of become almost distanced from it. And sometimes I can do that with my own life. I can sort of, it's almost like I'm looking at my own life from a distance and I'm seeing it as a story and a narrative. And I have to really reconnect with, it's also a way of protecting myself. I developed it when I was a kid because I grew up in a family where there's a lot of addiction and craziness. But it can mean that I get kind of quite distanced from my own life and I sort of see it in quite a clinical way. And that can kind of cut you off from your own emotional responses. And I have to sort of work at constantly rerouting myself in my own life. So that can be a weakness. It can cut you off. It can have a weird psychological effect, I think.
And the last question, Johann, your one golden rule for living a high-performance life that you'd like to leave people thinking about?
I suppose it would be about attention. You know, all your achievements will be the sum total of the things you paid attention to, right? There's an analogy that Dr. James Williams, who I mentioned before, said to me that really helped me with this. He said, imagine you're driving somewhere and you've really got to get to your destination and someone throws a massive bucket of mud over your windshield. Doesn't matter what you've got to do when you get to your destination. The first thing you've got to do is get the mud off your windshield or you ain't going anywhere, right? And I think the attention crisis is like that. We're all experiencing an attention crisis. And the attention crisis is like the mud on the windshield. I'm sure you've got much better things to do than deal with your attention problems. But if you don't deal with your attention problems, you're going to just struggle to do all the things you want to do. So I would say, know the value of your attention. And we all know that at some level. Never forget something that a brilliant professor called Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford said when I interviewed him there. He's one of the leading experts on organizational behavior and management in the world.
He wrote the no arsehole rule, didn't he? Yeah,
great guy. Love him. You should interview him as well. He's a great person. And he said to me, think about your sports team, your favorite sports team, right? We're just in the middle of the Euros. No one wants England to walk onto the pitch. The England players, exhausted, burned out, and with their phone in their hand to check their texts during the match, right? No one wants that, right? You'd think I was crazy. If Gareth Southgate suggested that, he'd be in even more trouble than he is now, right? Well, if that's true of your favourite team, that's true of you, that's true of your children, that's true of your colleagues. So I would say, know that attention is your absolute superpower. Know that your attention is being stolen from you by some really big and powerful forces, and know that we can take it back. But it requires a shift in psychology. We need to stop blaming ourselves and our kids and being angry with ourselves and with them, and start blaming the people who are doing this to us. And I guess my rule would be, we are not medieval peasants begging at the table of King Musk and King Zuckerberg for a few little shitty crumbs of attention from their table. We are the free citizens of democracies, and we own our own minds, and we can take them back if we want to.
What a powerful way to finish.
Hooray!
Johann, thank you so much.
Oh, cheers, thank you. And I meant to say on my publisher's taser me that anyone wants to know where to get any of the books we talked about or the audiobooks can go to, it's johannhari.com, and they can see where to follow me on social media, but I won't fucking see you, so.
So, well, honestly, and I'll say this, honestly, I'd love your books. I think your writing style is really, really engaging and really practical as well, so I can't recommend them highly enough.